I'm going to start off by basically talking about a few examples of successful nonviolent pro-democracy struggles, and some of the ramifications and some of the questions about that. And then I'll hand it over to Erica, who has a lot of quantitative and whose empirical work on this is quite significant. And both our presentations will be relatively short, so we should have plenty of time for some back and forth. But I mean, it's always a little awkward, for a talk about democratization to be led by Americans in the United States on behalf of the United States organization, because the attitudes around democratization, at least by governments and elites, have been pretty twisted. They've either been, oh, these other peoples are not ready for democracy, which is sort of what the West has used as rationalization for colonialism initially, and more recently for support for dictatorships and occupation armies and the like. And or on the other extreme, well, these since we're the great democracy, we can show them and create democracy for them, like invading Iraq, and of course we saw how well that went. But in fact, virtually all democratic movements that have been successful have been homegrown, and that using people's own innovations and strategies and tactics that they developed themselves, and I found it was a very powerful way and the best means available to bring down dictatorships. Now, and what's fascinating in my research on this, and Eric can tell you this as well, is that the strategic nonviolence action has worked against dictatorships in every continent, across cultures, across religions, across races, across colonial history. It's been used against monarchies, against communists, against military regimes, against so-called socialist republics, governments that have been backed by the West, governments that have been opposed by the West. There is something that there's something about the desire for political freedom and accountability that transcends the culture or society. I mean, how democracy takes shape will vary on a country's unique history and culture. But as I try to repeatedly have to tell American reporters, that my specialization is the Middle East, so I have to tell people, something, I spend a lot of time in that part of the world, and I can tell you that Arabs and Muslims do not like to be jailed, tortured, and murdered for their political beliefs any more than white Christians do. There's, but the success of these pro-democracy movements, have been quite remarkable. Indeed, of the nearly 70 countries that have made the transition, from some degree of from dictatorship to varying degrees of democracy over the past 3 or 4 decades, there were a handful of cases, that this took place through armed struggle, maybe 1 or 2 that most, through foreign military intervention. Maybe a dozen or so through elite guide reforms. But the vast majority, close to 3/4 of the cases, were from democratic civil society organizations engaged in strategic nonviolent action. Now, some of them were the real dramatic scenes, as we saw on the streets of Berlin or Prague or Belgrade or Tunis or Manila, where people mass in hundreds of thousands or millions, and the dictator flees in the night. But some are more gradual, like South Korea, Kenya, Taiwan, Brazil, among others, where where it was clear that neither the regime nor the pro-democracy movement could win an outright victory, but it would force the regime to open up a little bit. Civil society would fill that. Maybe you get some people in electoral positions here and there as that system opened up. And in combination from working within the system, working out, they gradually force things open. So over a period of years, you did end up eventually with a democratic system. And this people power, people power has nonviolent action has challenged, I think, a lot of myths of both the right and the left. It was not the leftist guerrillas of the New People's Army that brought down the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines. It was nuns praying the rosary in front of the regime's tanks and millions of others who brought Greater Manila to a standstill. It wasn't 11 weeks of bombing that brought down Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. It was a nonviolent resistance movement led by young students like Ivan, who were able to mobilize a large cross-section of the population to rise up against a stolen election. It was not the armed wing of the African National Congress that brought majority rule to South Africa. It was workers, students, township dwellers who, through use of strikes, boycotts, creation of alternative institutions, and other acts of defiance, made it impossible for the apartheid regime to continue. It wasn't NATO that brought down the communist regimes of Eastern Europe or freed the Baltic republics from Soviet control. It was Polish dock workers, East German church people, Estonian folk singers, Czech intellectuals, and millions of ordinary citizens. Similarly, Jean-Claude Duvalier in Haiti, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, King Gyanendra in Nepal, General Suharto in Indonesia, dictators from Bolivia to Benin, Madagascar to the Maldives, forced to cede power when it became clear that they were powerless in the face of massive nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation. In addition, we've had a number of cases in Bolivia in 1981, Argentina in 86, Haiti in 1990, Russia in 1991, Venezuela in 2002, where coups have been reversed when people went out in the streets and say, no, we're not going back, we're not going to accept dictatorships. Now, and yet, there is this, and I, especially as an American, I am not, who lives in a relatively free democratic society, especially as a white male, middle-class male. I can't pass moral judgment against oppressed people who feel the need to take up arms for their freedom. But at the same time, unlike a lot of I've never fallen into this kind of romanticization of a lot of people on the Western left have about armed struggle. Well, I think Murray Bookchin once referred to it as third world voyeurism. This kind of romanticization that by Western leftists who will never have to face their villages being bombed, death squads that the kind of horrific repression that comes down in counterinsurgency war situations. And also, but I think one thing that's really important to note is that in addition to all the many advantages we've talked about this week that nonviolent action has over armed struggle, an important piece is what happens after the dictator is overthrown. Because Erica will have the specific data on this, but there is a tendency that for armed groups, once they're in power, to fail to establish pluralistic, democratic, and independent political systems. There's a tendency basically any kind of military organization is going to be in a strict hierarchy of command and control. They see themselves as vanguards of the revolution. It promotes this ethos of this secret elite, strict hierarchy of command and control. The message is that power comes from the barrel of a gun. And when these guerrilla leaders become the new leaders of government, there's a tendency to continue leading in that style. A related problem is that what if there are other people with guns who believe that they are the vanguards of the revolution? And you end up with civil war and chaos. I mean, look at Libya is a good example. After the overthrow of Gaddafi, which I think most people agreed to was a very good thing, they had elections which led to a fairly moderate coalition winning. But in a country of barely 6 million people, you had over 200,000 men under arms who decided to take things in their hand, and the country's in total chaos right now. There's rival governments, factional fighting, extremists, terrorists. It's really tragic. Compare that to Tunisia, which, despite their struggles, and they've certainly had struggles, they've done remarkably well in establishing a democratic constitution and open political system, free media, etc. Contrast this with what it takes to have a successful nonviolent movement, and you have to have a much broader base to win. You need to build broad coalitions, with people who might have differing ideologies about what kind of economic policies the country should pursue, or what kind of international relations they should pursue, but agree that we want a more democratic political system. And that when you're building a broad coalition, to build a mass movement that requires the participation of much bigger numbers of people than a guerrilla war requires, you have to have a lot of there's got to be give and take. There's got to be compromise. In many ways, it serves as a model of a more pluralistic, kind of order. By contrast, it's very hard to it's hard to think of how a nonviolent movement would win if it doesn't have the support of a clear majority of people. You can have military coups with only a minority. You can have, there are other ways a minority can seize power. But you need to build this kind of broad coalition. Now, of course, the left critique of this big push about pro-democracy movements and nonviolent action is that, well, yeah, these people got rid of dictatorships, but they're still, they have these usurious debts. They got to pay the IMF and the old dictatorship. They're forced to adopt these, free market, reforms that end up, hurting much of the population. And again, unlike a lot of Americans, I don't pretend that liberal democracy is the be-all and end-all in terms of social justice. But the important thing is that when you liberal democracy, even though my vision of a just society is more radical than that, liberal democracy allows for the political space to make more radical reforms possible. If you look at Latin America, when nonviolent movements played a key role in bringing down the brutal right-wing military dictatorships, for a number of years, they were replaced by these center-right governments, that again, engaged in these structural adjustment programs and a lot of dubious policies, that did inflict a lot of economic hardship. But unlike during the military era, people had the political space to organize. Trade unions, peasant leagues, the progressive church, women's groups, human rights activists, and the like. And more recently, you've had the so-called pink tide of the election of some relatively progressive governments. You have a burgeoning civil society movement that is fighting for environmental and social justice and things like that, without having to fear the death squads coming in at 3 o'clock in the morning and carting them away. And that's important. Kind of a running joke in the years I've been here and have been working with ICNC is that Peter Ackerman and I have very different political views on a number of things, especially economic policy. He's very much in a free market, and I'm a socialist. But what we agree on is that whatever your preferred economic system, if it's under an authoritarian government without accountability, they're going to screw it up bad. And that with a more democratic system, those of us who do have different ideas about economics and other issues are able to work, organize, get people to support our views, and can at least have a chance to help bring about the visions that we have. And indeed, the lessons from these successful democratic revolutions, that is, the skills that people learn in the struggle, in the organizing, have gone in to work for more radical, broader changes. So that's why I have problems with sort of the supposedly left critique that's saying, oh, what's the difference, if you still have the, the exploitative economic relationship, what difference does democracy make? Oh yeah, democracy does make a difference, and especially if it's brought about through a popular grassroots struggle. So those are some broad ideas I wanted to throw out, and I want to hand it over to to Erica, who can share some of her empirical findings on this topic. Yep.
All right. I think Stephen gave us a great set of propositions to work from. And one of the things that he highlighted was the necessity of building a broad-based coalition full of active grassroots participation in order to even succeed in the first place. And I want to kind of map this out for a second for us to take a look at what it might look like over time for a nonviolent campaign to expand the diversity of participants such that it might place itself into a winning domain. So what that might look like is that this is diversity over time. High level and low level. Here's time. Now, ideally, for a nonviolent campaign to succeed, it would be increasing its diversity over the course of the campaign. So here you would be seeing, say, who are the different types of players that people have been talking about who are critical to form coalitions with in a campaign? Just name some general groups. Labor unions, okay, so they're in there. Who else? Which types of groups? Cultural groups. NGOs. Whose? Media? Soccer fans. Youth groups. And students. Small groups like women. Small groups like women. Small groups like women. Yeah, like opposition parties. Okay, so what we can see here, you're often going to get religious authorities coming in, right? Yeah, ideally what we've been saying is, very simply, during the course of a nonviolent campaign, the more the merrier. Like, welcome everybody to the party so that the campaign can get really big and that it can have access to different points of leverage within those pillars of support, right? So, okay, we accept that that might be a key element in determining whether the campaign achieves that revolutionary moment. But then what happens at that revolutionary moment? Well, this is a mess, right? How are we going to deal with all of these groups that have now developed a clear stake in the outcome of the campaign, that wish to create or achieve or be involved in some form of the new political, social, economic order, and meet their extremely diverse economic, social, and political interests so that they're satisfied and they stay part of the new system? Well, we can certainly identify a lot of cases where it looked like a really highly participatory nonviolent campaign had succeeded in bringing together not the usual suspects, like Iran. The Iranian Revolution brought together Marxist-Leninists and Islamists, right? I mean, it was just a very diverse campaign. And what happens? Within a year of the success of the campaign, the Islamists completely purge out the Marxist-Leninists, declare the Islamic Republic, and there's a very bloody counter-revolutionary phase. You could make the same argument that that's what we watched on Monday night when we watched the film about the Egyptian revolution. Really similar dilemma. So what I'm going to talk about here is that the dilemma for nonviolent campaigns translating their victory into sustainable, relatively democratic governance is the dilemma of where do you funnel participation? And how do you deal with representation of all the people that just got you to win? That's the key dilemma going forward. So let me back up a little bit and tell you that the way I think about this is thinking about who's going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers of the new victorious campaign. So among the winners, again, you have this very diverse coalition with all kinds of different interests. And among the losers, you know, you're going to have losers. You always have losers. There's no such thing so far as some kind of utopian outcome where we've never seen anybody lose in these types of campaigns. There's always losers. And the question is, what happens to these deposed elites or people that are loyal to those deposed elites who also themselves have diverse interests and more or less would like not to be completely excommunicated from this society? So what do we do with all these diverse groups? Now, political scientists have just started to think more robustly about these types of dynamics, but the field has actually been largely motivated by what you might call structural determinants of democracy. So for example, one of the most cited reasons of explaining why democratic transitions work is based on economic development. So there's a really powerful finding by some scholars named Jaworski and Lemonji, who found that once a country has transitioned to democracy, it's never backslided into authoritarianism if the average GDP per capita is above $12,500 US. So there's a base level of economic development that many people think is kind of a necessary threshold for democratic success. Now, some countries have survived without that, but their argument is that some basic level of economic development is necessary. Why do you think that would be the case? Why would development match to democracy?
Because
Yeah, Isabel.
people have more at stake in the democracy as they have more financial freedom and opportunities for their kids with education and buying things.
Okay, so one thing might be that they see how their dollar, what's in their pocket is related to the political system. They have a stake. And they also, because they have enough to survive, they don't have to worry about sustenance and survival. They've got some leisure time. And leisure time then yields the opportunity to be more civically minded. In fact, there's a 800-page book by a guy named Barrington Moore called The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And on page 668, the thesis is made. It's 4 words. I'm going to save you the trouble of reading it. It's called No Bourgeoisie, No Democracy. The idea is simply if you don't get a middle class, you don't get to keep your democracy. Now, you never have to read those books. I did it for you. The second thing that a lot of structural theorists argue is necessary is that these campaigns, or these countries have some kind of laws, really robust laws against political and economic discrimination. Now, of course, a critique against this is, why would leaders, elites in countries, especially authoritarian countries, create laws against political and economic discrimination? They usually don't do those things voluntarily. So this whole field hasn't really seen social movements emerging in the context of these kinds of legal institutional structures. And then the third thing is that apparently if you're a former British colony as opposed to a former Portuguese colony or a former French colony, you're more likely to be democratic. We have no real reason for explaining this, and it may actually not hold in recent years. I haven't gone back and looked at the more recent collapses. But I want to turn our attention to some other kind of interesting findings about the way that civic life and the way we associate with one another on just common bases might actually create a better quality of democracy. So there's this guy named Robert Putnam. Has anybody heard of Robert Putnam? Okay, so some of you have heard of him. That's awesome. He's a Harvard political scientist who I think is brilliant, not mostly for his books, but for the fact that he got an NSF grant to live in a Tuscan villa for 2 years and study Italian democracy. Pretty smart guy, right? And his study was created into a book called Making Democracy Work. And in this book, what he did was he looked at Italian democracy in the North, which he portrayed as highly functional and really robust and responsive. And he compared it to Italian democracy in the South, which he said was highly corrupt and full of, pizzo transactions and the things that Shaska illuminated us with earlier today. And Putnam's main question was, why does democracy work so well in northern Italy and not in the South? And what he did was he spent 2 years eating amazing pasta and going around the country. And what he did was sort of household surveys and other things to find out what is it that people in the North do in their lives that's different from people in the South. And the main finding he came up with is that they're really civically engaged. Like, they do stuff like this, right? They meet and talk about the future of their society on a regular basis. They talk with their neighbors. When they have friends over for dinner, politics is not a taboo subject. It's like the subject of the meal, right? And there's arguing. It's not that they're meeting with people that agree with them. They're actually meeting with people that disagree with them. And it's quite common cultural practice to get in these types of conversations. The average household subscribes to like 3 to 5 newspapers and periodicals. They are highly engaged in civic clubs and organizations and even sporting leagues.
That's pretty consistent to what Tocqueville found in America.
Right, exactly. It's exactly the modern kind of equivalent of de Tocqueville's comments on civil society and the importance of the public sphere. And de Tocqueville saw this as what he called the lubricant of democracy. And actually, for Putnam, it's not exactly a lubricant, so to speak, but it's more of a mechanism that creates really activated citizenry that demand that their politicians are responsive to their grievances. So it makes people pay attention to elections. There's very high voter turnout. There's a lot of mobilization around the polls and so forth. And the argument is, this creates a pretty responsive and efficient government, such as it is in Italy. No offense to anybody. And then in the South, you have a situation where there's basically 2 social institutions, the mafia and the church. But other than that, people were not civically engaged. In fact, they were quite deliberately disengaged, in part because it was too dangerous to be engaged, but also because of feelings of apathy and the lack of empowerment. So no newspaper subscriptions, would rather really not read about the news, actually. No civic organizations and clubs. It's church and it's the mafia and it's not a lot else. Now he kind of updated this study in a more popular version of his book, which he called Bowling Alone. And Bowling Alone is the version you'd want to read unless you were an academic and liked the really nerdy stuff. And in that book, what he talks about is actually he refers to American democracy, and he says that democracy and the quality of democracy in the United States is actually on the decline because people don't play together anymore. His book is called Bowling Alone because in the 50s, 1950s, Americans all belonged to bowling leagues. Do you know what bowling leagues are? Okay. Yeah, anyway, I could say a lot about that. But they were involved in bowling leagues and all kinds of extracurricular sports and activities and clubs and civic groups and so forth. And it was actually not taboo to talk about politics over dinner. You know, it was really similar to what he was describing in northern Italy, but that now people only select into groups where they talk to people who share their political beliefs because it's too uncomfortable and in fact considered somewhat taboo to engage in these types of conversations in polite company. Also, we go bowling by ourselves. We don't join bowling leagues anymore. We sit at home and play video games on the internet rather than going out and playing soccer in the field with our friends. So his argument is that this is going to degrade the quality of American democracies. Now, if you take the social capital thesis of Putnam's argument and you apply it to civil resistance, what we can see is that civil resistance is almost like social capital on steroids, right? Because not only are people openly confronting and disputing political conversations and ideas, but they are doing so in a very high stakes, high risk situation that might even create much tighter social bonds than this sort of more ordinary type of social capital might do. And as a result of that, my argument is that, and in the book with Maria, what we hypothesized was that these social capital mechanisms would be really ramped up in moments of civil insurrection. And because of that, we would start to see those same mechanisms of democratic accountability and responsiveness in countries emerging from civil resistance campaigns compared with countries that didn't. So here's a chart with some of the data about this. The horizontal axis is a 21-point scale called the polity scale. Has anybody heard of the polity scale? Okay, so this is a data set that political scientists used basically to index whether a country is a democracy, a totalitarian regime, or something in between. So -10 is a totalitarian regime or an absolute monarchy. A +10 is an advanced democracy. And really, most political scientists will say that a +7 or higher is pretty much an advanced democracy. A -7 or lower is an authoritarian regime, and then sort of this -5 to +5 region here or there is what we call anocracies or hybrid countries. They have some features of democracy and some features of authoritarianism, and these are based on their procedures, their constitution, their procedures for competition for the executive, whether they have checks and balances and so forth. So it's an index. And the horizontal scale here is showing you the adjusted predicted probability that the country will be a +7 or higher 5 years after the campaign is over. So in other words, that it will be a democracy 5 years after the campaign is over. I say it's the adjusted predicted probability because what we did was we looked at all the other factors that prior scholars have said impact whether a country is democratic or not. So we looked at things like GDP per capita. We looked at the region of the world, whether it was a British colony, whether it had some forms of discrimination, the population size, the neighborhood. We looked at all of the different determinants of democracy. And then we looked at, if you hold those things constant and you basically group these countries by whether they had a nonviolent campaign or whether they had a violent campaign, what's the effect? So what we can see on the left is the violent campaigns. And for those that had, that were authoritarian regimes, that's like a -5 to a -10, a year before the campaign was over, you can see that there's virtually no probability that they're going to be a democracy after. From the -5 to 5, you can see that the probability starts to increase. The max is around 20%. So 1 in 5 countries, that's kind of a weak state, hybrid regime that faces a violent insurgency becomes a democracy later. And then the really scary part actually is right up at the top of the scale. The democracies that fight armed insurrections are only about 50% likely to remain so. 5 years after the campaign is over. Does that make sense? What that means is about 50% of them are not likely to be democracies 5 years after the campaign ends. That is, democracies don't survive armed insurrections. Even if they defeat the armed insurrections, they backslide into authoritarianism. So if you look on the right side, what you see is a totally different picture, where even for authoritarian regimes, those countries that are on the -10 to -5 scale, you can already see that there's like a 5 or 6 times higher probability that they emerge democratic after the campaign ends. For the middling regimes, you can see that now we're really seeing kind of an exponential impact. And then for those countries that are democratic and that face a nonviolent campaign, almost all of them remain so. We also looked at Civil War onset. And you can see, I sort of mentioned this yesterday in the context of the violent flank conversation. But this actually looks at even nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks. If you compare the probability of those that result in civil war to just armed insurgencies, you can see that almost half of violent campaigns experience another civil war within the next 10 years. And those are major civil wars. That's over 1,000 people killed per year in the Civil War. So it's not, low-level conflict or something. And then nonviolent campaigns are just under 30% likely. So it's a significant difference. There are also indicators. This is from a doctoral thesis by a woman named Judith Stoddard at Rutgers, Newark. And she was just doing a very simple count of different sorts of indicators of personal well-being, human development indicators after these different campaigns. And she actually found that on a variety of different measures, things like infant mortality, GDP per capita, and things like that, that nonviolent campaigns were basically leaving behind countries in a much better position. And one of the best welfare or well-being measures is life expectancy. So here are the life expectancy counts. And what you can see here is that, as I mentioned yesterday, if you have a successful armed campaign, the infrastructural damage is such that compared to world averages, life expectancies post-conflict drop through the floor. That's what that effect is showing us there on that slide. And if you look at places where nonviolent campaigns have been successful, you can see that even relative to the world average, they're above it. So they're actually improving well-being after the campaign is over relative to global averages. So I think that there are a couple of different cautionary tales, and then we'll get you guys involved in the discussion. The first thing is the wisdom of moderating demands and expectations. For example, I guess you heard a little bit about the Polish Solidarity movement from Maciej. And what he talks about is how early on they negotiated for the right to create free trade unions. That's what they were after. And in the early 80s, they didn't negotiate directly for democracy because they knew if they did that, they would be completely shut down. So they negotiated for the right to form free trade unions. And within a few years, had 10 million registered members. They had their own underground magazine. They were creating underground universities and building an entire parallel system that they were able to sort of leverage off the space that they'd fought for and won. So that when the time came 8 to 10 years later to start getting real, they had all of that leverage from that mass mobilization that they were able to use as a bargaining chip so that they could negotiate effectively for democratic reforms. Now, if you contrast this with China, for example, in the case of Tiananmen Square, people argue that the student uprising that was involved in the sort of early days of Tiananmen Square had as its kind of overall vision the promotion of democracy, but its immediate demands were the right to form free student unions and better conditions for students at universities, including food and housing conditions. Once the students effectively negotiated for those types of rights, they then pushed for democracy. And that's when the worst repression, the repression that stays in everyone's minds, where the tanks came and surrounded the students and a massacre occurred, came about. So it makes one wonder what might have happened, and of course it's always easy to evaluate in hindsight and from afar, but it makes one wonder what might happen if movements commit to trying to get smaller scale political space and then use that political space as a way to increase their bargaining power rather than asking for everything all at once. The other thing is, of course, the difficulty that can come when the institutions, the governing institutions, never get the trust to actually sort out conflict in the society. So this is where basically people never develop trust in institutions and elections, and they always sort out their politics in the streets. You could make the argument that Thailand is kind of in this cycle, where each election brings a different level of polarization to the society, and opponents of the elected groups will come out and basically hijack the election by conducting sit-ins and completely disrupting the society until either the military steps in or the parliament resigns. And this has basically been the pattern in Thailand for the past 12 or so years at this point, where political parties don't survive, mostly because they're deposed one after the other by nonviolent campaigns. One of the ironies of this, of course, is that Thailand is one of the most successful cases of nonviolent resistance because they overthrow people so often through nonviolent resistance. But then it makes you wonder, well, really, how successful is it becoming? Because people never develop a sense of maturity around the institutions themselves, or the institutions never mature. I shouldn't say people don't develop it, but the institutions don't mature long enough for people to establish trust in them. And some people may have made the same argument about the Philippines, which has quite a lot of mobilization surrounding electoral candidates and then the opponents to them once they're elected to office. So this is just kind of an open question of what effects does this have on a society in the longer term. By the way, if anybody wants to pursue a master's thesis or a dissertation or just some independent research, nobody that I know of has actually studied this. Like, what are the effects of repeated nonviolent campaigns over and over in societies? And what effects might that have on different levels of kind of stability, probabilities of civil war, and so forth. So what I'll say here is that, as Stephen said, I think neither of us is some kind of unconditional and unqualified supporter of democracy. We recognize its many shortcomings and downsides. And we kind of, at least I recognize the baggage in standing up here from where I sit and saying that we should care about this outcome. But that said, for those that do, what we know is that nonviolent campaigns do tend to outperform violent ones with regard to what the country looks like after the conflict is over, both in terms of democracy, civil peace, but then also in terms of things like life expectancy, infant mortality rates, and other things. Joshua Tucker, who's a political scientist at NYU, has a co-authored paper where he suggests that what happens in the 2 years after a successful revolution is absolutely critical. And what he says is critical is the emergence of a viable new party or new alternative. And then in fact, if these don't emerge within the first couple of years, people become quite disenfranchised with the political system, and they will not trust the institutions long enough for them to mature. So what this means for organizers and people engaged in mass civil resistance is that it's pretty important to think about, in the immediate term after victory, what does the new kind of constitutional or conflict resolution mechanism look like in this country? And how can they formulate that in a way that captures the interests of these very diverse groups? But even if they can't do that, what I would put to you is that it's still better to try that and to fail than to resort to armed struggle in terms of the long-term outcomes that we are observing here today. So what I'd like to hear from you, and Stephen and I can just sort of co-lead a discussion, I guess, is what's been your experience, or what are your kind of key frustrations or insights into how this has worked, or what the real difficulties are? Have we gotten it right here, or is there something else going on that we're not talking about? Hamza.